We're going to talk a little bit about what we're speaking on today, on today's Wisdom Talk. It's all about embracing unity in an increasingly diverse world. So tonight we're going to be diving into this topic with Ramananda. In a world where diversity is one of our greatest strengths, we're going to discover how the common threads that unite us all can be explored. We're going to explore the beauty of our differences and the power of our shared humanity through the perspective and the lens of the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita. So I'm going to introduce our guest this evening, Ramananda. He began studying the Bhagavad-gita in 1994 and spent 10 years living as a monk in an ashram in Scotland as a brahmachari monk. And he spent most of that time traveling all over the north of England, distributing books, giving programs, teaching the wisdom of the Bhagavad-gita, traveling from Yorkshire to Preston to Leicester, Lancashire, all over the north, Newcastle, Manchester. But in 2005, he took a step back from monk life and married. And he now has 3 boys and lives with his wife, as we just learned, in Leicester. His wife also teaches courses in Bhakti Yoga. And she also translates languages. She translates books from English to Hungarian. And they've lived together as a family prior to being in Leicester for 20 years. They were in sunny Scotland. Now Ramananda splits his time between London and Leicester, and he serves as a key member of the Think Gita team with the Think Gita project, teaching, sharing, facilitating, and running courses all around the Bhagavad Gita. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to this evening's guest, Ramananda. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're so very welcome.
Let me know how I can be of service.
Well, just you appearing here this evening is, have we got light?
Yeah, hold on, let me adjust that a little bit. There you go, that's better.
We can see you now. I was going to say, tell us a little bit. I mean, I've touched on your story just there a little bit. What was the catalyst? You've just moved into a new home. So what was the catalyst for that, moving from Scotland?
For moving into, oh, good question. Few different reasons. The main one was that we were living, so we have one temple in Scotland that we sort of like ISKCON. So I guess if anyone doesn't know, ISKCON is the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. That's the organization that ran the temple that I was living in as a monk for 10 years. And we have one temple in Scotland, and it's in a relatively isolated place. It's in a sleepy little village about 25 miles south of Glasgow. Nice little place, nice place. But there was only one school in the village, and it's not a great school. So we decided on the sort of, by the inspiration of a friend of ours who had already sort of had the same experience, we decided to try homeschooling our kids. So, and that actually worked out really well from an academic perspective. They're really, really bright, intelligent boys. And now they're sort of getting to that point of life where they really sort of know what directions they want to go in. But from the social perspective, they were sort of missing a lot of association of kids their own age. So many visitors would come to the temple who had kids their own age. They had friends. Also, we spent around about 3 months of the year, or at least they spent about 3 months of the year in Hungary. And in Hungary, we have this huge rural farm community with about 300 members, loads and loads and loads of kids. They have their own school. So they had a great social life in Hungary. It's not like they grew up completely devoid of friends and social life. But when they were in Scotland, it was sort of limited to certain times and certain days of the week. And we just got to a point where we felt that they needed more. They needed a more sort of active social environment. And I, about a year and a half ago, completely unexpectedly, this door opened where it was an opportunity for me to get involved with Think Gita. And I was really, really inspired to be able to do that because I had taught Think Gita connected courses in Scotland a few times. I love the content that we have to work with. I love the style and just everything about this project. And so when that opportunity came my way, at the same time that we were thinking that our kids needed something different, it just seemed like, okay, Krishna, God, the divine, the universe, whatever word you feel comfortable with, was opening a door and saying, time for a new chapter of life. And
Mm.
also, my wife and I, we turned 50 this year. Both of us turned 50. And actually, in our tradition, 50 is a time in life to sort of reevaluate things and to start thinking about moving into the sort of next phase of life, which is all about slowly sort of winding down from the more family, children centered side of things and start moving in more towards the time of sort of not retiring because that's many years away yet, but definitely moving into that next stage of life. So it
A
felt
gear
like,
shift.
oh, yeah, it felt like, okay, time for a new chapter, time for a new phase. Sorry,
Yeah.
I
No,
have this
that's
horror.
amazing. That's amazing. There's so many great things in there. One of the things I wanted to touch on was you were sharing a story about how you walked into a shop wearing a Think Geeta t-shirt.
Oh, yeah.
And you said it still surprises some of the Leicester locals. There's a huge South Asian population there. And you
Mm,
said it's very surprising to the local South Asian population to see an English white-coloured male
yeah.
wearing a Think Gita t-shirt or chanting Hare
Yeah.
Krishna. Tell us a little bit about your experiences of that, particularly around the north of England. You must have a few stories.
Well, to be honest, I mean, I spent 10 years traveling around the north of England, and that was a long time ago. That was from sort of 94, that was from 95 until 2005. And we did go to areas that were very sort of large Asian communities, but we were also going into areas where there was very minimal Asian communities. And so we were meeting all different demographics, all different sort of balances of the population. Um, and to be honest, most of the programs we were doing, most of the sort of Bhagavad-gita classes, festivals, were actually much more at that time the sort of white British population that were coming to those festivals. And in Scotland, even now, it's funny actually, after a month in Leicester, about a week ago, I traveled back up to Scotland to get the last of our things. We had a few things still up there that a friend was keeping in his house. And so I went back up to Scotland. And after a month living in Leicester, I was sitting in the bus station waiting to sort of get the bus over to my friend's house. And I'm thinking, what's wrong here? What's different? And then I realized I couldn't see any Asian faces anywhere. It was all sort of white Scottish faces. Because in Scotland, that's more the demographic. There is an Indian community in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, in Aberdeen, and many of them come to visit the temple. But when you're out on the street, it's not the same as it is in Leicester or London. So
Mm,
I guess I mean, in one sense, that's kind of somewhat connected with the theme of this evening that Britain is such an incredibly diverse place and every city has its very unique sort of demographics. So
mm, mm. That's really interesting. And the place you stayed and the ashram as a brahmachari monk for 10 years, was the demographic of your fellow monks there, were they predominantly Indian? Was it a mix? Was it quite diverse?
um Scottish, English, Hungarian, that was
And
basically the thing. Very, very few Indians actually.
wow,
Very
wow.
few. At least into you see, at the time when sort of entered into that life, there was quite a large number of monks living in the in the sort of ashram in Scotland. It was all together when we were all sort of back from traveling. There were around about 25 of us, something
Mm.
like that. So a relatively large number of monks. Now, there's a very small number of monks currently at that particular ashram in Scotland, maybe two or three.
Mm.
So it's that, and that's just the way that life works. It's, there's always waves and different things going on at different times. Things are always
Yeah.
changing. It's the nature of the world. The world
Yeah.
is a place of change, and things are always changing.
Yeah. And you met your wife on your travels through, was it through the North of England or was it through a connection at the ashram?
I met her up at the ashram. She was also staying there.
Oh,
Yeah, she was
wow.
also staying there. She's Hungarian, um, and she'd been living there at that time for about 2 years. And
Okay.
yeah, we have very similar sort of. I mean, she's definitely, we say my wife is the better half. In my case, it's really true. It's like she's really, really so intelligent and so gifted, and I feel like I'm just, you know, helping out. She
I
she's
think
the better half.
I think you're being being modest there, but you did mention that you told me earlier, just before everyone joined, that your wife played a big part in homeschooling the kids, and
Mhm.
also them spending 3 months of the year in Hungary is such a unique experience and perspective for them to leave the UK and go to a place like that. How has that affected their development and what and how important do you think that is as well to give kids that rounded approach and perspective?
I think if you can, I think it's great, to be able to give them exposure to different cultures, different countries. If the opportunity is there, I mean, we had quite an interesting life with the kids growing up. My wife's brother, he, so we have a very interesting family. Um, so we're sort of practicing bhakti yoga. My wife's brother is a practicing rabbi. And so while we're spending well, not half of our time, but while we feel very sort of connected to India, he sort of is very connected to Israel. And while I married a Hungarian lady, he married a an Israeli girl. And in his family, they sort of had this practice where he would speak to the children in Hebrew. His wife would speak to the kids in Yiddish. His father, so our kid's grandfather, my wife's father, would speak to them in Hungarian, and then at school they would learn English. So they grew
Wow.
up learning all these different languages. So we felt quite inspired by that. And she asked him, well, how did you do that? And he said, basically, I only speak to them in this language. She only speaks to them in that language, and so on. And children have got this amazing capacity that from the age of 0 to something like the age of 7 or 8, they have the capacity to simultaneously learn 5 or 6 languages,
Wow.
and just the way that children's brains grow. So my wife would talk to them in Hungarian, I would talk to them in English, and they just grew up bilingual, and they're fluent in Hungarian and English. And so when they go to Hungary, it's just no problem at all. They know that they just switch from one language to the next. So that's usually the big barrier, is the language barrier, but that wasn't there. So they grew up sort of in Scotland, in Hungary. We took them to India a few times. And it's a good, valuable experience if you are able, not obviously, sometimes the way that the world works, it may be difficult, but if I think as much as we can expose our kids. And I think as well, it was nice that, we grew up in Scotland where there were Indian people,
Mm.
British African people, obviously, sort of white Scottish people, white English people, and they just grew up in that multicultural environment. And so they've just got a natural acceptance
Mm.
of different cultures.
Yeah.
It's just they don't even think about different colors, different cultures. It's just that's the world they've always known.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they're completely embracing unity and diversity.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
which is so wonderful because you're discovering common threads in there that unite all of those things, which is exactly what the whole subject of today is. So your kids are leading by example.
Yeah, yeah.
And how have the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita come into that as well? Because your wife was it homeschooled them? So have they grown up reading the Bhagavad-gita as well?
They have. Yeah, we taught them all the basic syllabus, maths, English, sciences, and so on. We took advantage of materials and facilities that were available online. Obviously, there's a lot available nowadays. My wife's a very academic lady. She's very, very intellectual, very, very academic. So she didn't have any problem with, you know, knowing how to sort of present the information. But every day we would sit down, we would read the Srimad Bhagavatam, we would read the Bhagavad Gita, we would take them up to the temple. But we also really tried to raise them in a sort of in the mood of this is what we've discovered.
Mm,
You know, these are the sort of spiritual teachings that have really, for us, made a big, big difference to our life. Let us share those with you, but also it's up to the individual whether this path is for them.
mm,
So I think in raising children in a spiritual environment, when we are living in a world which has such an amazingly diverse such amazingly diverse spiritual cultures and teachings and presentations, then we have to be careful not to sort of have this very dogmatic approach where this is the only way, and if you don't choose this way, then you've made a mistake. But right, and I think as well having that sort of diverse family where my father's an atheist. We're practicing bhakti yoga. They have Uncle Rabbi in Hungary. You know, it's like, you know, they sort of have this exposure to many, many
yeah,
sort of spiritual and religious cultures. And I
yeah,
think that's a good thing that they're able to see that and they're able to appreciate that diversity.
yeah. I think it's amazing that you've made sure that it's not been indoctrinated. You know,
Mm,
it's important for them to have that choice and that perspective because something you were saying to me earlier on, I called you this afternoon to talk about this evening. One thing
mm,
which really struck me is you said how no everyone's path, spiritual path is different. There is
mm.
no one spiritual path which mine is different to yours and everyone else's on this course. So it's about creating an environment and a space that can facilitate that growth in the best way
Yeah.
possible without enforcing it.
Yeah, and even within whatever tradition we are following, you know, so you know, I've been practicing bhakti now for, or at least trying to, learning to. And that's another thing. It's like you may say, oh, you're just being modest. No, that's actually the reality of the spiritual path, is that we're always learning, we're always developing, we've always got more to learn, we're always a student. Even the teacher is a student. And actually, one of the things that qualifies a teacher to be a teacher is that they still think of themselves as a student, that they don't think of themselves that now I know everything. I
Yeah.
have nothing else to learn. So it's not modesty, it's not humility, it's just the reality of like I said before, you know, I obviously I'm studying the Bhagavad Gita. I'm practicing bhakti yoga. I'm going to use the name Krishna. Someone else may have another name that they choose in their sort of understanding of that supreme absolute truth. But whatever name we feel comfortable with, the reality of that supreme absolute truth is that it is limitless.
Mm.
It's limitless. That's the nature of transcendence. Transcendence is limitless. So even transcendence itself, even Krishna himself, is always learning about himself. This is one of the most incredible things about transcendence, is that even that supreme absolute truth is always increasing, always expanding. So there will never be a time when there is not something new to learn.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, and you've been traveling around the country for over 10, 15 years now, teaching, facilitating, running courses. What are some of the changes that you've seen, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years as you've gone on your travels? Has there been a change in attitudes, the thirst for spiritual knowledge, the uptake? What are some reflections that you have from that?
It's an interesting question. My answer might, to some, be a little controversial, but I can only give my own honest observations. When I first sort of took up this path, and like, the first 10 years, I was quite young. That was in my 20s. So and I actually grew up, I was raised, I said that my father was an atheist, but that wasn't always the case. My mother was quite a devout Christian, and I was raised in a Church of England Christian family. I went to a church school. We went to church every week. And I sort of, in my childhood, my memory of childhood is that at that time, most of the people I knew identified in some way with some religion. And generally, in the part of the country where I lived at that time, most people identified themselves as Christian. Most people I knew went to church in some capacity or were a member of some church community. And even if they weren't practicing devoutly, they sort of had a sense of identity with that religious community. What I've seen over the last 30 years is that more and more and more and more people, and especially as we sort of enter into different generations, that's also a thing. It's like growing up, I didn't identify as Generation X. But now it's like, are you Generation X? Are you millennial? Are you Gen Z? It's like it's a big thing now. And so what I've seen is that as generations have sort of passed and have sort of entered into the equation, more and more and more people are very, very skeptical of organized religion, institutionalized religion. But at the same time, there is a growing, very, very exciting um, interest, enthusiasm, and thirst for spirituality, for spiritual wisdom, for spiritual knowledge. And I think that that's a big part of the subject that we're talking about here, is that one of the reasons why there's a sort of distrust of a more sort of institutional model is that within that institutional model, it can, not always, but it can have the potential to restrict a person's spiritual growth. And because spirituality is such a unique and individual experience, whatever you're practicing, whether you're a Bhakti yogi or a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or whatever you are, Buddhist, whatever your path is, no two people's path and journey and experience is going to be the same. And so you just cannot put anyone into a box and say, this is what your journey has to be. And so it's really important to be able to sort of facilitate that spiritual growth. If we're going to be a spiritual community, because community is really important, association is really important, being able to come together with other spiritually minded people is important. And we want to facilitate that. We want to provide that facility. But at the same time, within that community, there needs to be a sort of acceptance that every single member of that community is having a completely unique individual journey. And how can we serve them and help them in that journey while at the same time not telling them this is what your journey has to be? So sorry, I'm rambling, I'm ranting, but
No, it really resonates because that's one of the things which I'm sure you'd agree, which really draws me to coming into places when we get together and think Gita's group, because everyone's just it's such a diverse group. Everyone's different. Everyone's on their own path. And
mm,
you're right, there's a distrust in institutions now, and we're living in this world of almost duality or on one side or the other, or there's a label on it. You're
mm,
either, you're either EDL or anti-immigration, anti-fascist.
mhm,
And right now, with what's happening out on the streets and politically, the climate at the moment, people are clutching to be associated with some kind of an identity which you have
mm,
to live or die by.
mm,
Otherwise, you have to be either here, neither here nor there. How can we view this through? How can we lean on the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita in times like this, and also
mm.
embrace embrace our own individual spiritual paths more?
Yeah. It's yeah, again, really good question. And I feel really inspired actually tonight. I was thinking, oh gosh, I hope I've got answers for any questions that get asked. But I
Don't
really
be my.
feel like as soon as you're talking, it's like, you know, inspiration's coming to mind. And
It's all
now,
based off what you're saying.
now this is actually a really exciting, to me, it's exciting. You can take it one of two ways. You can, and like you say, it's like there's almost a fear now of sort of saying, well, let's say, for example, there's two political opposing ideologies. And the idea is that, well, I have to be either this or this. And if I'm this, I have to disagree with everything that's here. And if I'm this, I have to disagree with this. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not, it's just not the way what life goes. And it's like there's a fear now of saying, well, to be honest, um, so I mean, to me, the most sort of black and white divided, politically divided thing that I sort of see right now is what's happening in the US, but it's actually happening everywhere. Now, I'm no expert in US politics, and if I embarrass myself by sort of, but what I see is that if you're a Democrat, you have to disagree with every single thing that Republicans stand for, and vice versa. But
Yeah.
when I look at the two of them, I think, well, those things I agree with, but those things I disagree with. And those things I agree with, and those things I disagree with. And there's a fear of actually being able to say that. There's a fear of being able to say, well, to be honest, I agree and disagree with both parties. And so I have to just decide, right here, right now. But looking beyond that, because it's not just politics, there's so much issue right now of identity. What's your political identity? What's your LGBTQ identity? What's your identity, like you said, in terms of immigration, in terms of this, in terms of that, in terms of religion? It's like everyone's looking for identity. Why is everyone looking for identity? Because for generation after generation after generation after generation, our identity has been based upon ultimately the body, the mind, the subtle body, our intelligence, our education. And no matter what we do, no matter what steps we take, no matter how we align ourselves in terms of our identity, in terms of our gender identity, sexual identity, political identity, no matter what we label ourselves, there's going to be something that just doesn't feel quite right and
Mm.
something that doesn't quite touch the heart. And so like you're saying, where does the Bhagavad Gita come into this? The very first thing that Krishna teaches in the Bhagavad-gita, and the foundation upon which everything else in the Gita is standing is the subject of identity. Until that identity is established in the Gita, everything else that Krishna teaches, none of it's going to work unless we've got that principle of identity. And what is that identity? Yes, we've got a body and you can't just ignore it. Yes, we've got a mind. Yes, we've got intelligence. Yes, we've got a psychophysical nature. We have to address those things. But what am I? Who am I? I am none of those things. I'm the spirit soul within.
Yeah.
And so once we start connecting to that spiritual identity, everything else starts falling into place.
Mm.
So this is the magic ingredient, the Bhagavad Gita, the principle of spirituality, the principle of spiritual identity. That's the magic ingredient which is missing in the world.
Mm.
Once that's there, all these other things sort of, okay, now we can talk. Because actually we're all brothers and sisters on the spiritual platform.
Yeah, so it's almost like all of this kind of populist politics, the nationalist politics, and all of the identity politics, and it's all kind of, and the fervor that's creating is all stemming from a misplaced, a materially misplaced search for meaning, which needs to be a spiritual search for meaning instead of a material one, because of how we are identifying our reality in the material world.
Yeah. Interesting thing just came to mind.
Please,
You
yeah.
know, many of us here, many of you here will be somewhat familiar with the story of the Mahabharata and the events which lead up to the events which lead up to the speaking of the Bhagavad Gita, and also the events which follow on from the speaking of the Bhagavad Gita. Now,
For those who aren't familiar, could you just give us like a 2 sentence?
I know I cannot give you a 2 sentence thing, but I can try and give a brief synopsis. The Mahabharata is an incredible historical story, actually. It's an incredible historical story. Mahabharata literally means Greater India. It's the ancient history of India. And in a synopsis, it's the story of one extended family which was split in half. Two brothers, each of whom had a number of children, and those two halves of the family were split and were at odds with each other. Now this is where it gets interesting, and this is the point I'm going to try and emphasize. One half of the family was generally considered very moral and very spiritually minded. And the other half was very, very sort of materialistic and really quite envious. And the more materialistic half of the family were trying to manipulate things politically to sort of get rid of this half of the family so that they could have the whole kingdom to themselves. That's about as brief as I can make it. But the interesting thing is that this very sort of morally, spiritually minded part of the family, there were 5 brothers, the Pandavas. So I'll give you their names: Yudhisthira, Bhima, Arjuna. Anyone who reads the Bhagavad Gita will know who Arjuna is. Krishna spoke the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. So Yudhisthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadev, 5 brothers, all of whom very, very moral, very spiritually minded, really, really incredible people. But they would often disagree strongly on how to deal with the situation. It's not that because they were on the same side, they all had the same opinion. Yudhisthira, the eldest brother, was very gentle, very humble, really wanted to avoid any sort of fight, any sort of conflict, to the point where he was practically willing to walk away and just live in the forest if it meant saving lives on a battlefield. His brother Bhima was just ready to just kill everyone right here, right now. And yet there was never any sense that, well, sorry, you go your way and I'll go mine. No, it was, how can we find the common principles that hold us together? How can we discuss our differences? How can we find and come to an agreement that everyone's happy with? How can we be willing to actually compromise our own beliefs and values for the sake of finding a peaceful resolution? And
Mm,
very often that's something that's really, really missing. But because they had that spiritual foundation to act upon, they were able to learn how to compromise, how to work out differences, how to agree to things, how to be willing to let go of one thing and accept another thing. So that spiritual unity is the thing that can allow diversity to thrive.
mm, mm. One of the things that was such an amazing reflection, because I've never thought about the Pandava brothers in that way in the Mahabharata, because they're obviously always seen as this unit of the five brothers. And of course, they all have varying degrees of different qualities, and they disagree on how things should be resolved, but they ultimately still come together.
Mm,
And that's really what's lacking in today's in today's society, and the way we try and tackle challenges.
mm,
One thing you touched on, which really struck me was you spoke about how they question how you can compromising beliefs and values in order to find spiritual solutions.
mm,
Uh, Often, especially when it comes to religion, culture, identity, people are so they hold on to their beliefs and values so strongly and so tightly to the detriment of others, so that a spiritual solution is not able to be found.
mhm.
What do we do in those kinds of situations?
Again, and it's interesting actually, because last time I was here, the theme was all about foundation, but I feel it's something that comes up again and again and again, is that a lot of the conflicts and disagreements that take place in the world are built upon the misunderstanding that there is such a thing in this world as a perfect solution.
Mm,
So, and also based upon the really, really, and we all experience this, we're all guilty of this, the incredibly stubborn belief that my way is the only way, that my way is the best way, that my way is the best solution. And that tends to be based on ego rather than on reality.
yeah,
And
and
if we
fear.
can and if we can actually just accept the fact that, well, in this world, okay, now, okay, how to explain this in a sort of, I get excited, but I also tend to go down rabbit holes, and I also tend to,
I can see you getting excited. This is the most animated
but
you weren't
yeah,
like
but
this.
I
You weren't like this before the Zoom started.
I go down rabbit holes, and I'm really, really, really bad at giving a short, simple answer to anything. It's like, oh, there's this, there's this. But there's an interesting verse in not in the Bhagavad-gita, in another scripture called the Ishopanishad. And the invocation mantra, and I'll chant the mantra because I need to practice my mantras. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Now, what it means is the supreme absolute truth is perfect and complete. And everything that emanates from that supreme absolute truth is also complete in itself. Everything that emanates from the supreme absolute truth is perfect and complete, including this phenomenal world, the world in which we live in, which is also a complete, perfect arrangement by the complete absolute truth. It's a bit of a tongue twister, and I've sort of paraphrased it, but the idea is that because the absolute truth is perfect and complete, everything that comes from the absolute truth is also perfect and complete. Now, the question arises, does that mean that this world in which we live is perfect? And the answer is that it's perfect in its intention. It's perfect in what it's meant to do. But what is the actual function and purpose of the material world? The function and purpose of the material world is not to allow us to have a perfect, complete life of sensual happiness and that everything is going to be perfect and complete. Rather, the actual purpose of the material world is to bring each and every one of us to the point of realizing that we cannot be happy if we separate ourselves from the source of everything.
Mm.
And so in the material world, there will always be no matter what we do, no matter what arrangement we make, no matter how much thought we give to things, there will always be a sense of incompleteness unless we connect with the supreme absolute truth. And so there also needs to be a sort of willingness to accept that no arrangement in the world that is sort of separate from that supreme absolute truth, that is separate from God, separate from Krishna, separate from the divine, political arrangements, educational arrangements, social arrangements. We can rearrange our body. We can change our body. We can practically have any body that we want if we've got enough money, but we're still going to feel a sense of incompleteness. And if we understand that, and if we enter into discussions, understanding that, well, okay, let's do the best we can, but nothing's going to be perfect. So let's come into this conversation being willing to compromise, hear everyone's perspective, and see how we can somehow come to an arrangement that we all agree may not be the best, but it's the one that we can all agree on. So I don't know if that.
Yeah, really, it does make sense. I think I recognize that mantra. It's the Shanti mantra, isn't it? It's like called the peace mantra.
It may be. It may be. But
It's very
it's from
ancient.
it's very ancient.
It's
Yeah.
very ancient, isn't it?
Yeah. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamadachyate Purnamadaya Purnameva Vishishyate.
Yeah.
I'm not the best person
I
to
remember
invite
hearing
for
that as a
Sanskrit
kid.
recitation.
I know that was really great. I remember hearing that as
It's
a
very
child.
beautiful.
Oh,
Very beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, wow. I think one of the biggest takeaways from what you said today is how we're often identifying with the mind, the intelligence, the body, the subtle body, but really
Mm.
it starts with identifying with who we are really here as the spirit soul. And that's
Mm.
effectively the first step we can take on our spiritual path and journey.
Yeah. I just remembered something. We went down a little rabbit hole a little earlier, and I
Yeah.
never quite got to the point. So
Go on.
the point I was trying to make before is that one of the reasons why there is so much emphasis right now on identity, I feel actually quite hopeful about it because I get the sense that there is a growing sense in the world that people are starting to feel like, who am I? Who am I? I need an identity, and somehow no identity is working for me.
Yeah.
And again, it's like I don't mean this in a sort of derogatory, challenging, prejudice sense, but even to the point where our own bodies, we're thinking, well, I don't feel comfortable in my body. And so therefore, does that mean I'm not a man? I'm not a woman? I'm not this? I'm not that? And I I really, really deeply, deeply, strongly believe that if we can just somehow share with people the wisdom of the Bhagavad-gita, and particularly this wisdom that don't worry if your body seems imperfect. Don't worry if your body seems like you don't belong in it, because actually we don't. None of us do. That this body is not who we are. So if we feel that this body is not who I am, that's actually a good sign. That means that we're awakening to the fact that we are different from the body, we are different from the mind, we are different from the intelligence. So rather than being repulsed by those feelings and wanting to sort of run away from those feelings, with the wisdom of the Bhagavad-gita, we can actually understand what a relief that I'm not this body. I mean, I'm like this. Growing up, I was this short, weird looking kid, that always felt, and I was always trying to be someone and something else. I was dressing up as my favorite rock stars, growing my hair long, always looking very strange indeed, and always feeling out of place and uncomfortable. And I actually believe that no matter how sort of confident people appear to be, all of us have got a sense of insecurity that, you know, am I really happy that the identity that I'm projecting to the world, the identity that I'm trying to reveal to the world, is that really who I am? And if we can share the wisdom of the Gita, it's such a relief to know that I'm not this body, so I don't have to worry if it's imperfect. And I'm not this mind, so I don't have to, okay, physical health is important, mental health is important. Recognizing our intellectual nature and sort of working with that is important. We have to earn a living. What did Krishna say to Arjuna? The first thing he said was, "You're not the body." The second thing he said was, "But you've still got a body, and that body is a king. So get out there and fight, do your duty." So
Yeah,
we still work with what we've got, but in the knowledge that that's not who I am. And
yeah.
who am I? I am this beautiful, perfect spark of the absolute truth.
Mm, mm.
And that is such a relief.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. You can see how passionate you are about it. It's amazing. And it really resonates because oftentimes we can come really unstuck in our association with what's happening at the level of the mind, at the level of the body. And it can create stumbling blocks or it can create just blocks. But what you're saying is that you're hopeful at that and you're yeah, you're hopeful that the solution lies in that problem.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, really good, really well put. Yeah. It's the very problem itself, if addressed in the proper way, is the answer to the problem.
Yeah,
The problem is identity, the answer is identity.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean to say, yeah, okay, I've been practicing the Bhagavad Gita for 30 years, but I'm still entitled to my opinion. I can still say, well, my personal feeling is that I would rather vote for this party because
Mm,
it doesn't mean we don't vote. It doesn't mean we don't get an education. It doesn't mean we don't have opinions about, what would be the most ideal way of dealing with things in an imperfect world. But it can also mean that, well, I also respect your opinion.
yeah, yeah.
And I still love and respect each and every one of you, even if we completely disagree
Mm,
politically, socially, religiously.
mm,
We are actually allowed to be friends. We're allowed to have deep, deep affection for one another and deep respect for other, and actually come together and spend time together, even if you strongly disagree on certain things
yeah,
in the world.
yeah, yeah. I've got a question for you, but just before I get into that question, thank you for all of these reflections, Ramananda. If anyone's got any questions for Ramananda, please put them in the chat and we can get into them. I'm just slightly conscious of time.
Mm,
But my question for you is, I mean, at the moment, the way things are, the climate outside, I think there's a Hindu festival coming up called Raksha Bandhan, which is like
mm,
where brothers and sisters, it celebrates the bond between these siblings, and they tie it's like a string, like a dory, like a
Mm,
rope around the wrist to symbolize that bond between the brother and sister. And then they put like a tilak, like a red
mm,
dot on the head. It's like a blessing. And I
mm,
was traveling from Leicester to London, and my 10-year-old little cousin Amaya put one of these red tilaks on my head
mm,
on Sunday. And as I was getting the train back to London, my uncle was like, "Oh, you better wash that off, actually,
mm,
because you don't know who you're going to see on the train. You might be like some EDL people on the train, so you just have to take it off." And my little cousin couldn't understand why
mm,
I was having to wash this tilak off of my face, which is
mm,
really an expression of your spirit, of your culture or your spiritual
mm,
practice. And I know of people even in my family. I've got someone who's come from India and studying in Newcastle, and they don't feel safe staying in Newcastle on their own.
mm.
She's an Indian student, Indian girl, so she's coming to stay with my family for a couple of days until she feels comfortable again moving up. This is the kind of climate that
Mm.
we're in. How can we, as spiritualists, as spiritual beings, how can we move through these kinds of times in the next couple of, hopefully, just months or weeks?
Well, who knows how long these things will last? But I mean, growing up as a monk, well, I say growing up as a monk, but sort of my spiritual growth as a monk, the externals were a big part of that.
Yeah.
Shaved head, tilak, seeker on the back of the head. I have a little seeker. I don't have a full-on shaved head, but I usually have a bit of a buzz cut because it's just I'm used to it now. Um, but for our own sake, I think it's important to realize that the external emblems of our tradition don't make the tradition. The external emblems are not the things which define us. They're not the things that make us spiritual. They're not the things that mean that they're not the things that make the difference between practicing and not practicing a spiritual path. Um, so that's one thing is that we can sort of be peaceful at mind walking through the world and not feeling that we are compromising our standards, our beliefs, our principles by feeling that it's like I know that I never feel overly comfortable in certain places. I do, like in London, which is such an incredibly diverse place. I feel like I can go on the tube wearing a dhoti, like robes and tilak, and it's like people there are programmed that the stranger you look, the more they won't notice you. It's almost like this programming that's there in London. Like, the more normal you look, the more you stand out. But the stranger you look, it's like, I'm just not going to notice this person now. So I don't feel too bad walking around the underground wearing strange clothes. But
What people's reactions seeing you in your tilak and robes in
they
Leicester? In Leicester,
in Leicester, well, because there is such a large sort of Hindu community in Leicester, then yeah, no, they don't really. They just, yeah, they just ignore me. But I
yeah.
don't, to be honest, I don't usually dress like that nowadays, unless I'm really visiting a sort of temple program. It's just not how I dress. And I have sort of come to the acceptance that maybe right now we are in and this is also, again, unity and diversity. Different people have different perspectives and different opinions about this. And I think it's a great conversation. But my personal feeling is that we want to make the path of bhakti available to everyone in the world. We want to make the principles of the Bhagavad-gita, and we want to show, we always say this. What is bhakti? What is Krishna consciousness? It's whatever you are, whoever you are, add Krishna to that. We're not trying to make a society of monks and nuns. We're trying to just introduce the principles. And bhakti is an affair of the heart. Dress has a place, tilak has a place, neck beads has a place, but what actually is bhakti yoga? Every single part of it is there, everything. And so even if we're living in a world where for one reason or another, we as individuals make the personal individual choice to decide that I don't feel so comfortable right now, sort of flaunting the external emblems of my tradition, it doesn't change anything in terms of our spiritual journey.
Mm,
And if
mm.
we can share that, if we can show that, because this again, it's like people are thinking, well, if I get into, okay, I really like the Bhagavad-gita. I really like the wisdom of the Gita. I really like kirtan. I really like the food that you guys have. But does this mean I'm going to have to shave my head and wear robes? Because if it does, I don't feel comfortable with that. And so, and it doesn't mean that. That's not nowhere in the Bhagavad Gita does Krishna say you have to change your clothes. Nowhere in the Srimad Bhagavatam does it say this. It's all about an affair of the heart. But
Perfect.
that, but that is my personal individual opinion, for which every single person here is absolutely welcome to completely disagree with, and I will not stop loving any of you.
Oh. Please share your reflections in the chat. I definitely agree with you that bhakti is an affair of the heart. In fact, every time I speak to my grandmother, whenever I'm on FaceTime with her, and my partner's there with me too, she always finishes the call. There you go. Deepa's put a heart emoji on her chat. She always finishes with a little one of these.
Mm,
She always just goes like that right at the end because that's where that's where it all emanates from, and that's the seat of the spirit soul. So
exactly. Exactly.
Amit agrees,
Mm,
very true. Listen to your heart. I agree. Spiritually starts and ends from within.
yeah. But just to clarify, I like if I get the chance, I like putting on a dhoti and a kurta and
No one's
tilak.
saying
It's
you don't.
it's
No
like
one's
I
saying you
like doing
don't.
this,
I mean, you
but
wore one
I,
for
I
10 years, didn't you? So
yeah, but it's not that's the thing that defines me, and it's not the thing that sort of makes, if I'm chanting on my beads, if I'm chanting Hare Krishna on my beads, it's not that the chanting is different if I'm wearing a dhoti or if I'm not wearing a dhoti. It's just, there's a time and place for these things. And if within that time and place you feel comfortable in that sort of dress, then great. But we really want to share the message with the world that spirituality, bhakti, is an affair of the heart.
it's an affair of the heart. And Anne said here, it starts and ends from within.
Yeah, yeah.
So on that note, I'm just going to say a massive thank you to you,
Thank
Ramananda.
you.
And I'm sure everyone on the chat will agree. I'm seeing some big smiling faces. That was a really, really wonderful conversation. And I think it was really helpful to bring, especially the whole what we spoke about identity, bring it all back to the square root, which is identity of the soul and the
Yeah,
spirit. And I think
yeah.
that's a great place to start for anyone who's on their spiritual path, wherever they are on their spiritual path.
It's the foundation. It's that is the foundation upon which everything in the Bhagavad Gita rests. Is this principle of identity? If anyone here has done or is doing our Think Gita circles, and we study the Keshava Swami's acronyms for the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita. Chapter 1 is sort of setting the scene. So chapter 2 is really where the teachings, the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita begins. And the acronym for chapter 2 is a very, very easy one to remember, is Gita. Gita, so the Bhagavad Gita. So the acronym is Gita, and that stands for Guru. So we find teachers, we find people whose presentation of bhakti sort of connects with us. That's also another very interesting subject, is that it's not that one guru is better than another. It's that we all have our own individual nature, and our individual nature can sort of relate to one presentation maybe more than another. So we find a teacher or teachers whose presentation really sort of makes sense to us, and but then once that source of wisdom and teaching is established, what's the first thing that is taught? Identity. And then after that, two duties. That while we are living in the world, we might be spirit souls, but we're still in the world. And so while we're on our spiritual journey, it doesn't mean that we neglect our material duties, responsibilities, obligations, family, children, education, career. That has to be there. We can't just all live like monks. And even if we do live like monks, I can assure you, I did it for 10 years. There's a lot to do. There's never a dull moment. There's a lot of work to be done. So you have those two duties.
Yeah.
The identity is there, but then within that identity, we have that identity is running on two tracks. And if we can do that in a nice, healthy, successful, and balanced way, then the result is Atmarama, spiritual enlightenment, spiritual realization, spiritual awakening. It all begins with identity. And if we can share the principle of identity with the world, it is the magic ingredient which is missing.
I feel like we could do another whole session maybe next time on those two duties, the spiritual and the material duties, because it's super important to have that balance. Some really nice reflections in the chat. Absolutely beautifully presented session to illustrate the oneness of humanity and the differences enhances our lives. Thank you for this. Such an inviting conversation and an example we can apply to daily life without changing who we are. Just add Krishna. Love it.
Beautiful.
Someone else, Badisha wrote, it's always lovely to hear from you. Cannot thank you enough, Prabhu, for your valuable insight and wisdom. Looking forward to hearing from you and more. Hare Krishna.